Welcome everyone to AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday, part of AURI Connects monthly online series, featuring updates on the work that AURI is doing to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. I'm Dan Scogan, the AURI Director of Government and Industry Relations, and your host for Webinar Wednesdays. The AURI Connects program is hosted by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute in Minnesota. This program aims to actively engage all participants in the food and ag industry to improve competitiveness of producers, businesses, and entrepreneurs through ongoing, purposeful connection of resources and partners along the value chain, and increased knowledge of opportunities, technologies, and trends. Remember that this event is being recorded and archived and can be found at auri.org. Today, we welcome back to our program Dr. Claire Sand of Packaging Technology and Research, as she presents sustainable packaging concepts for fresh ground beef that can improve consumer confidence by providing tangible and visible demonstrations of the beef industry's commitment to reducing its environmental footprint. Remember that you will be muted during the presentation, but you can send us written questions via the Q&A portal. To provide some context for today's discussion and to introduce Dr. Sand, we welcome AURI's Business Development Director in Food, Jason Robinson, to Webinar Wednesday. Jason?
Thanks so much for the introduction, Dan. I'm glad to be here this afternoon. Let me start by just saying that with the rise of the plant-based foods movement, or as I like to call it, plant-based version 2.0, where consumers are interested in incorporating more plants into their diet, as opposed to version 1.0, which you could otherwise know as traditional vegetarianism, animal protein sources are taking a bit of a beating in consumer perception. This project aimed to provide a potential consumer-validated approach through packaging of strengthening the beef value proposition by highlighting the environmental gains made by the industry through a visible packaging choice. The research described here dovetails nicely with AURI's mission, which is truly focused on leading research to catalyze innovation, generate new ideas, and support partnerships in value-added agriculture. This project, in particular, was funded by the Beef Checkoff in partnership with the Minnesota Beef Council and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. So let's start by briefly highlighting the rationale for this research by exploring the why behind more sustainable packaging options for ground beef. In the recent past, the beef industry has experienced success by focusing in two key areas. The first would be in the density and presence of nutrients in beef, particularly in communication to consumers. And the second is through improving profit margin with enhanced production efficiency. Both have been achieved while also decreasing the environmental impact of beef, though these environmental gains haven't been effectively communicated to consumers. This, therefore, leaves an opening for enhanced communication that can drive the beef value proposition, focused on reinforcing these environmental gains by using consumer-recognized, more sustainable packaging options. This more sustainable packaging represents a consumer visible and tangible vehicle that can effectively convey these sustainability gains to the consumer. Validating this hypothesis across various options with consumers on ground beef was the primary focus of this project. And we truly believe that the idea of more sustainable packaging may be able to be the vehicle to truly drive this message home around the environmental footprint gains that the beef industry has made. Now, let me turn the rest of this webinar over to Dr. Claire Sand of Packaging Technology and Research, who will guide you through the options developed, consumer feedback on those options, and a potential path forward. Claire?
Thank you, Jason. Let's move on to the next slide. This is me. Basically, I'm a food science and packaging science expert and value chain expert who loves working with and is a big fan of AURI. Next. This is our project team. I did want to recognize that they are AURI members on the team, and without them, this project would not have been successful. And also thank you to the support of the Beef Checkoff and the partnership with the Minnesota Beef Council and the National Cattlemen's Association. Next slide, please. This is a summary of the world of PTR. You can look through this at your leisure, and but basically we work in the interface between food science and packaging science. Next. Here's our agenda. Jason actually covered the rationale really well, so we're going to skip through that slide, but it's there if you'd like just a little bit more context. We're going to jump into the key takeaways, go through concept development, and then the testing process that we used with consumers, and then we also did some evaluation of the environmental impact of the different options. And then we're going to move into analysis and conclusions and then wrap it up with opportunities and recommendations. So let's get started with the rationale just real quickly. I'll show you that slide. Just a quick summary of this is, again, as Jason mentioned, it was really tapping into what's the difference and what would really resonate with consumers, beef consumers on more sustainable packaging. Let's go through the next, the key takeaways. And then we have about 3 or 4 slides on this. So I'm just going to go through these in detail here, or actually in summary, and then we'll go through them in more detail at the end. But this is to provide a context of where we're headed in this presentation. So basically we developed 6 different concepts. If we look at these from left to right, we have, and this was in the context of compared to current packaging, which is a polystyrene or foam tray with an overwrap, which could be PVC or low density polyethylene or different variations of plastic. But that's what consumers typically see. So these were the different concepts that we came up with. The one on the far left is a paperboard tray with a paper and polyethylene or plastic overwrap. And then the one just to the right of that is a recyclable tray, sort of what soda bottles are made out of, with a mesh overwrap that we often see in the beef industry, usually with hams and things like that. The next one is the Chug Pack, which we felt was really important to address that one as well, because some consumers buy only in the chub form. And then that is a plastic and paper overwrap. A sealed plastic bag, very minimalist with twist tie. And then basically a chub in a box is the next one. And then plastic formed over a paperboard card. And we are starting to see the one on the far right in the marketplace now. On the far lower left, you see the different colors that we looked at, and consumers really found color to be a direct index of sustainability. And then is the time temperature indicator. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's called intelligent packaging. It's basically packaging that communicates to the consumer. And in this case, it gives the consumer a green light if the product is okay to eat. Yellow light if eat within a few days, red light, don't eat at all. Next slide, please. This slide is a lot to handle, but hopefully by the end of this, you'll be an expert at this slide. On the x-axis, we have consumer perception of sustainability. So that's what consumers think. On the left, consumers did not view something as sustainable. On the right, they viewed it as more sustainable. On the y-axis, we have low environmental impact at the bottom and high environmental impact on the top. So consumers perceive the current EPS tray, which is circled here in right, or expanded polystyrene tray, to be the least environmentally friendly. But when you look at it on the actual factual environmental impact, you have a fairly low environmental impact. So that itself was intriguing. Next slide, please. In the upper right here is the sweet spot. So that's where we have a low environmental impact and consumers think it's sustainable, right? So that's pretty cool. So we did have 3 concepts that really resonated with consumers. Those 3 concepts we'll be highlighting throughout the presentations. And those were the ones on the far left when we looked at the initial key takeaway slide. Next slide, please. These were the key takeaways, basically 4. One was to improve the consumer perception of sustainability of the current package, both the chub and the tray. Develop text and graphics to effectively communicate more sustainable packaging with the current package or even other choices. The third one was to assess and implement alternative packaging formats that really connect with consumers on sustainability, but then also food waste. The last one is to link package sustainability to the metrics on food waste. And we'll talk about that one at the end. So let's get into the meat of the project. Haha, no pun intended, I guess. So what we did is we used 4 different steps to develop the concepts. These were actually not really, I guess you could say steps, but they were done concurrently, things that we dove into. We wanted to make sure we understood the design constraints, and so we used those as direction and to ensure more sustainable packaging solutions really aligned with what was known about ground beef consumers from prior research. And we got this prior research from the Minnesota Beef Council and the National Cattlemen's Association, so thank you for that. We also did a study on what were the value chain needs, and by the value chain, we're talking about from the meat manufacturers all the way to the end of the life of the consumers. And then, of course, we also looked at sustainability concepts. So this resulted in 6 concepts, 4 colors, and an intelligent packaging option for consumers to assess and to do life cycle analysis on. This is pretty cool. Surprisingly, consumers throughout the world see meat for sale in surprisingly consistent manners. And this is likely because we really optimized how we have done meat packaging over the years. This aligns with a much more complex view, interestingly though, with sustainability global. We also have a higher incidence of recycling in the EU and other higher income countries comparable to the United States. For example, in the European Union, polystyrene, or the current foam tray, is actually recycled with curbside pickup and highly efficient, but we don't recycle that typically with curbside pickup in the United States. Next slide, please. This is the value chain from the consumer to the packaging supplier, and it's pretty complex, but we did an assessment and at each point in the value chain from production to the consumer, and this included from manufacturers, retailers, consumers, collections, and sorting. And then we also looked at it in the context of using less packaging, recyclability, bio-derived or recycled content, and then of course compostability. The interesting thing about meat is the shelf life is really critical to ensuring more meat is not wasted in the value chain. And then we use the life cycle analysis tool, which I'll refer to as LCA throughout this presentation to provide a metric. Next slide, please. This is what we look at when we look at sustainability. And I'll take just a minute to talk about this. On the left, we have the source of the packaging, so where it comes from. And on the right, we have what we do with it after use. Sometimes we see a muddying of the two, but it's really important to keep the two succinct. So package sourcing, what happened and what happens after its use was explored in depth. More sustainable sourcing was refined to include recycled content and bio-derived polymers, which are in commercial use today. And then concept development focused on current perceptions of paper versus plastic and the reduced visibility of a plastic in each concept. One of the things that we know about sustainability is if consumers see a huge swath of plastic, for example, on the top of the meat covered, they perceive that as a lot of plastic, even if it isn't a lot of plastic. And then we also looked at more sustainable disposal options. Litter, of course, is in red because that's something we don't want to happen with our packaging. Next slide, please. So using these tools, we've seen this slide before, we developed 6 concepts. I wanted to take a minute though and really talk about the concepts in detail because we did gloss over them a bit. On the left is the paper tray with paper plastic overwrap. It's composed of a paper tray, clear plastic overwrap, and a paper overwrap that seals on the bottom. The plastic is not made with recycled content, or it's not recyclable or compostable. The paper tray is recyclable or compostable, and users can place extra ground beef on the tray, and the tray is folded over and then resealed with the overwrap. Variations include a recycled content tray or bio-derived content overwrap. The one on the next one to the right, we have a plastic clear tray with a clear plastic overwrap. So it almost looks like the meat is in fact, or the package is in fact invisible on the shelf. It has a resealable top tab on the resealable tab that loops around to the bottom of the tray. The plastic tray is not made of recycled content, but is recyclable. And the package opens by peeling back the resealable tape on the tray and pulling it over the top of the meat. The ground beef is divided into 4 portions, as shown by 4 indents on the actual tray base. Portions is something that really identifies with consumers on sustainability. And then the extra ground beef can be placed on the tray and then folded over and then sealed with resealable tape. Variations included recycled or bio-derived content for both the tray and the overwrap. Third from the left is the Chub with the plastic paper overwrap. This is a pretty interesting package to think about. The plastic and paper overwrap is not made of recycled content, nor is recyclable or compostable, but we did have variations that did explore that in terms of the LCA analysis and even what consumers perceived. It's divided into 4 portions as shown by the 4 sections on the clear plastic overwrap. And the 4 portions I'm referring to then would each be a 1/4 pound of ground beef. This was designed for 1 pound ground beef. The ground beef is removed by by peeling the tear strip on the paper and plastic wrap. The package that's third from the right is a minimalized plastic bag. It's composed of just a clear plastic bag. Could be made out of PET, or which is what soda bottles are made out of, or low density polyethylene, which is what bread bags are made out of. Not made of recycled content, nor is recyclable or compostable. It opens by breaking the seal and then untwisting the twist tie at the top of the bag. We're starting to see this with Parmesan shredded cheese and things like that in the marketplace now. The third from the right is basically a Chub in the box. So it's the same thing as the one that's third from the left, but it's in a box. And so we can have a much more rigid type of display and format for the consumers. The extreme right one is a card with a skin pack, and this contains 1 pound of fresh ground beef like the other ones, not recyclable or compostable, but the paper card is recyclable or compostable. And it opens by separating the paper card from the plastic overwrap. And there's not really a way where a consumer can wrap up the ground beef after it's opened. The indicator changes from green to yellow to red. We talked about that before. This connects with consumers on sustainability, and consumers actually perceive this to be pretty favorable. And then we also looked at package color. We narrowed it down to these 4 colors. The one on the lower right, the brown, was used because there are a lot of alternative meat products or alternative meat products that are using that brown craft paper color in the lower right. Next slide, please. Boy, that was a long time on that slide. We'll go to the next one quickly. So we're going to talk about consumer testing first, and then we'll move on to life cycle analysis. We use Minnesota consumers to assess concepts and to gauge the perceptions of the concept's sustainability credentials. In addition to the concepts, consumers gauge the influence of color and then the freshness indicator. We wanted to let you know that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, remote instead of in-person testing was employed. And so this could have been a source of error. We did use the same consumer testing firm for the work, although it was remote, and this firm was packaging testing and research. Next slide, please. This is what the interface looked like to respondents. Next slide. Consumers rated all concepts as more eco-friendly than the current overwrapped expanded polystyrene foam tray that we see in the marketplace. Additionally, consumers ranked the concepts in order from more sustainable to less sustainable. Next slide. They were able to have an asynchronous exchange via chat, and AI was used to assess the commonalities. Some of the interesting things that popped out is recyclability was perceived as important, whether or not they recycled or not. But the paperboard tray and the paperboard and plastic overwrap and the plastic recyclable tray really resonated with consumers in terms of recyclability. The concerns about the paperboard tray were interesting, and it's similar to what we've seen with other research when we have kind of a wet product like meat in contact with paperboard. Perhaps it's flashbacks for when we used to all buy milk in paperboard containers and they leaked. But it wasn't trusted, and there was a lot of concern about the meat moisture soaking into the paper and things like that. The recyclable tray, though, with the mesh overwrap was perceived as a very reliable material. And the sealed plastic bag was seen as quite sustainable for the small amount of packaging, but the use of plastic raised concern. And in that plastic bag, which is on the lower right, we just see a lot of plastic. And so it's not as much plastic as we would see with a tray format, just logically, but consumers, because they see a huge swath of plastic, they identify that as more plastic. The one in the middle there, consumers don't identify that as much plastic. It may have as much, or just about as much as the one on the top, but consumers see less of a huge swath of plastic. Next slide, please. When presented with the different color combinations, 83% of them liked the craft color, and they connected that with more sustainability. Next slide. Consumers also stated they would pay an average of $1 more, which is quite a bit, for the freshness indicator. We recently did a project with a customer, and the ticket price on average indicators like this are about 5 cents. So it's interesting that consumers would pay as much as $1 more for an indicator like this. As we're seeing meat prices and other prices increase, we are expecting consumers to care more about how long a product will last and to not want to throw out food that they've paid so much for. Next slide, please. So now we're going to jump from consumers to talk more about a tactical life cycle analysis. We used a program called Paquette, which we can control. For those of you who are life cycle analysis aficionados, we can really control the scenarios and things like that. So we use the same scenarios within each different concepts. So this shows, I wanted to just go in depth here a little bit. This is an example from the paper tray. And what we looked at was different tray concepts. So for example, for the tray, we looked at solid bleach sulfate, which is pure white tray with a polyethylene coating. But then we also looked at clay-coated newsboard, which is what you see cereal boxes made out of, with a polyethylene coating. So we looked at those two different tray options. And then we also looked at overwrap options, including half polyvinyl chloride or PVC, half polyethylene, half recycled paper, and half solid bleach sulfate. And so you can see the different life cycle impacts shown in gray, and the composite of these was considered when comparing the different options. Next slide, please. So what we got then is life cycle impact. So we're going to talk through just 3 different life cycle impacts. The first one is climate change. The next one we're going to talk through is water. I think it's land, and then it's water. So this one, the graphs are all the same, but I'll take a minute to just explain them. So we have environmental impact. High is at the top on the y-axis, and then we have the different options. So when we look at climate change, this is sort of what consumers consider to be, or what we consider to be the most common way of looking at life cycle impact data. We see the current package on the far left, and that little dotted blue line that you see shows what the current package number is. So again, lower is better. So the current package has a pretty low life cycle impact. The ones that had a lower life cycle impact were the Chub with the paper polyethylene overwrap, and then the kind of the minimalist bag concepts. So the other concepts had slightly more with the PET tray and the overwrap being the highest of the different options. But you may wonder why the current package is so good, especially because consumers think it's really bad in terms of the environment. Well, this is simply because it's expanded polystyrene in the foam tray. So it takes up a lot of space, but that space is actually composed of a lot of air. So it's a foam package. And so the environmental impact, or the amount of plastic that's actually used, is pretty low. And when we talk about shipping packages around the country and things like that, it weighs a lot less than other products because it uses the foam to have a lot of the substance. Let's go and look at, I think, land use. Yes. So again, same thing, low environmental impact on the bottom, high environmental impact on the top. Boy, what's going on here? The current package looks phenomenal. Again, we see these low points with the chub and the plastic, but we see high points there. And we see the high points anytime we have paper. So for example, the chub in the box, which is the one fifth from the left, we see, wow, a huge impact. And that's the paper connected with the land use. Let's look at water. So water, similar story, but less muddied here. Or more muddied here, I guess you could say. So again, we look at life cycle impact focused on climate change because it really focuses on a whole bunch of different parameters and CO2 equivalents. So let's go to the next slide. Next, we're going to talk about what this all means. So we've seen these graphs before, right? So let's go into them in a little bit more detail. So basically, the top line is that consumers really didn't agree with the factual environmental impact. Let's explore this a little bit more in detail. So on the x-axis, again, we have consumer perception of sustainability. On the left, consumers did not view it as sustainable at all. And that's where we see our current package there that's circled in orange. And on the y-axis, we have low environmental impact is at the top, right? So that's the best in terms of the environment, and then high environmental impact is at the bottom. So thankfully, as you would expect, nothing is at the lower left-hand corner, right? But when we looked at environmental impact of the current tray, we see it as actually pretty good. But consumers perceive the current overwrap expanded polystyrene tray to be the least eco-friendly. It had the third lowest water impact, and it had actually the lowest, or among the lowest, third from the lowest in climate change impact. The interesting thing about the alternatives, which were more sustainable, is that consumers perceive the minimalized plastic bag and the chub with the paper plastic overwrap as to be the second and fourth worst eco-friendly concepts, despite them actually having a very low climate change impact. So what this means is essentially consumers are confused, right? And we can do things about that. We can guide consumers, and we'll talk about color there and things like that and the results of that. But so if we took the current package and we modified the color so it was a much more sustainable color that consumers connect with sustainability, or put something like the intelligent packaging on, that would be a way to make sure the sustainability accuracy of the package resonates with consumers. Next slide, please. So this is something that is really good news. We did have three concepts that resonated with consumers and also had a pretty low environmental impact. The one that was the lowest was the chub in the box of the three, but then we did have ones that had comparable environmental impact, and you can see that going from the current package on the left there and going kind of drawing a line with your eyes, the environmental impact of the alternatives of the paperboard tray and the paper plastic overwrap were a little bit worse, but they did connect with consumers, and kind of that's the sweet spot that we were looking for. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some opportunities. Boy, there were a lot. And so there may be some questions on these at the end, and that's fine. So we're going to take a bit of time and go through these in more detail. You did see these in the key takeaways earlier. But one of the things that the work showed us is that we can improve the consumer perception of sustainability of the current Chug package. The LCA data, or the life cycle data, showed us that the current Chug package has a low environmental impact, but it doesn't have issues with freezer burn and slacking that are associated with the tray package and that relate to consumers being able to store the package longer. But consumers did not perceive the package as sustainable. Updating the Chug to appeal to consumers in terms of quality as well as sustainability is an opportunity to provide more factually sustainable packaging that consumers actually believe is more sustainable. Some of the strategies to increase the consumer perception of sustainability for the current Chug package are to assess the use of recycled paper as part of an existing overwrap to decrease the environmental impact while increasing the perception of sustainability, essentially breaking up the plastic. We also wanted to recommend assessing options of portioning, marking on the current Chug package, since portioning did correlate with sustainability. When we look at improving the consumer perception of sustainability of the current tray package, we can explore value chain linkages that increase recycling rates of polystyrene. And this is something that stores, as well as companies, are kind of jumping on board with, wanting to recycle more things or packaging that is recyclable. So advocating for curbside and store drop-off of recyclable polystyrene, because we can recycle polystyrene, and we do in a lot of countries, but just not in the United States. And advocating for use of recycled polystyrene in the meat industry and other industries. We can also assess the efficacy of implementing means, let's say color, labeling, to demonstrate to consumers that it is containing recycled polystyrene or how to recycle it, and assess graphics and labelings to explain the high air content of polystyrene. Maybe air from the farm could be a neat image for consumers that would resonate with sustainability. So let's talk about point 2, which is to develop on-pack communication strategies that effectively convey sustainability attributes of the chosen package. We can advocate for recycling and the use of recycled polystyrene. We can use color, a very effective means, text, shape, and also intelligent packaging. In point 3, we can implement alternative packaging that really resonates with consumers. And so those are the 3 options that we saw in the sweet spot in the upper right, which were the PET tray with the mesh overwrap, the paperboard tray with the paper plastic combination, and also the Chug package with the paper plastic combination. Point 4 is to really conduct deep research in linking sustainability metrics to food waste. And as I mentioned earlier, as prices go up with food, this is something that is going to really resonate with consumers because we're seeing high amounts of food waste, of course, with consumers that we've seen. But as the economy tightens, or is tightened now, we're seeing consumers want to make sure they can keep their product fresher longer and not have to throw it out since they spent money on it. Next slide, please. Finally, there is a major opportunity that I just talked about to link sustainability and food waste. And basically, it's linking food waste and packaged waste. We can improve the environmental impact of packaged food when we purposely connect with consumers on packaging that decreases food waste. This shows the packaging and food waste in the value chain. About 16% of meat waste occurs after the consumer actually buys the wheat. And this is a major impact on the environment and the economy because the cows have already been fed, the meat packaged, shipped, sold, and then it goes bad after the consumer buys it. So this is something that would be for future work. Next slide, please. This, for those of you who like some light reading, this is a summary. We did this in connection with this project, but it was basically consumer considerations, really understanding what consumers think now on more sustainable packaging. You know, what is their perceptions? Some of the things that we found is that there are over 300 definitions from consumers and various groups on what sustainable packaging is. So when you think about the results of this research, it's not so surprising that consumers were a bit conflicted and confused about what was actually more sustainable, and the lack of alignment between the life cycle analysis results and the consumer perceptions. Next slide, please. At this point, I believe we're going to take some questions.
All right, Claire, thank you. Yes, we are going to take questions, and we remind our participants that you would go to the Q&A portal to ask those questions. And we're going to start with a rather long, looks like a comment/question. Did you consult with local recycling facilities to determine which plastic and paper products are actually getting recycled now and are projected to be recycled in the future? While most plastic and paper products are hypothetically recyclable, many are not accepted in residential and commercial recycling programs because there's no viable end market for those materials. For example, polystyrene foam and plastic films are not accepted in curbside programs due to processing issues and the lack of viable end markets. So when thinking about being factual, these facts need to be taken into account in order to achieve the desired sustainability of these packaging options. The real end of life of these materials is a very important component to take into account, not just the hypothetical desired end of life management of those materials. So, Dr. Sand, did you get that?
Yeah, that's something that we hear a lot. And that's why actually, you know, from a value chain perspective, it's really important to analyze the value chain of recyclable, and for that matter, anything that is collected, compostables, you know, all that type of thing. So, and that's why when we looked at the consumer perception of sustainability with the current tray package, that's why we included advocating for curbside store drop-off of recyclable polystyrene. It is a fact that polystyrene, especially expanded polystyrene, is recyclable. I mean, I don't know how many countries are in the EU, but they can't all be wrong. And they collect polystyrene and they recycle polystyrene. And so there's a lot of information out there about whether you're an advocate of recycling or not an advocate of recycling. But the number one thing we know from life cycle analysis is that if we reuse something, if we recycle it into something, as opposed to creating new materials, that does reduce the environmental impact. And when we think about that, that makes logical sense. But that is a good point that we do need a market pull. And so in the recommendations, we also advocated for the use of recycled polystyrene by the meat industry. We are seeing more recycled plastic in direct contact with food. The FDA, last time I looked, I think it was a couple of years ago, approved 8 different direct recycled content or direct contact with plastics, and that was for PET, but we can have direct contact with food and recycled plastics, and there are different processes that we use, and we do use that globally. And so advocating for the reuse of recycled polystyrene by the meat industry that makes a lot of sense to me, because if we're having the meat industry needing to use polystyrene for a lot of different reasons, including machinability and production lines and things like that, we need to take some responsibility, I guess you could say, and have the meat industry actually reuse some of that recycled polystyrene. But I agree with John that there does need to be a pull and a push for this. But again, looking at the life cycle impact of this, it's really important to recognize that recycling does lower the environmental impact. Whether you're a fan of compostability, reusability, recyclability, incineration, waste to energy, a fan of everything except litter, the number one thing we have to do is to have the collection infrastructure to do all those things.
And in that same vein, we have a question: how useful is a recyclable plastic when news articles and studies have repeatedly shown how non-existent the end-use markets are for recycled plastics?
That's an economic thing. So yeah, so it's a push and a pull. Yeah, I know there's a lot of news out there. There's a lot of news out there about a lot of things. And but no, the fact is we do use recycled content quite a bit. We as consumers see recycled content paper bags all the time. We see recycled content. Most aluminum cans are made of about 50 to 75% recycled content. When we recycle glass, we need cullet to crystallize the glass into new containers. So we do see that a lot. Recycling does work, and it does work for plastics. I don't understand actually why there is a lot of information out there that we don't use recycled plastics. We have companies that only sell recycled plastics for thermoform trays like clamshells you see in the market, but then also for recycled content PET. So we are using recycled content plastic. The interesting thing now, because the price of oil is so low, that recycled content plastic is actually more expensive than virgin plastic because plastic comes from oil. And so we need, and companies are making commitments to use recycled content plastics and are honoring those types of commitments. But when I was at Kraft in the early 90s, we actually used recycled content plastic for our salad dressing bottles as a market test at the time. So it's been possible for a long time, and we are using it. The economics are the tough part these days.
Have there been considerations to publicize the life cycle assessments of the food products themselves along with the packaging LCAs directly on the package? They say consumers hardly know of LCAs, so showing it on a package would really help their understanding of the nuance in the whole system.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Consumers really like to have that information. I believe it's in the UK, Tesco has been using this for about 5 or 6 years or so. They've actually combined the life cycle impact of the food itself and the packaging. And so when the consumer buys something, they see two different numbers. So if you're buying, let's say, dried mangoes and you live in Minnesota, we tend not to grow mangoes in Minnesota. So there's a life cycle impact of getting the food, to you, right, in Minnesota, but then there's also the life cycle impact of the package. Those actually are pretty helpful to consumers. What we actually find out, although consumers see a lot of packaging because it's on the outside of the food, they don't often take a step back and do the comparative life cycle impact of the food that's grown versus the packaging, especially with something with meat, which is so has an impact on the environment that's high compared to other products, and so we need to do all we can to protect that product, to make sure that it doesn't go bad, right? Because then we're actually wasting the plastic or the packaging as well as the product. And so the two, linking the two together is extremely important. And yes, there have been very successful uses of that. And the German Green Dot program, which was I think finally launched in 92, actually uses that system. And so the consumers are actually given the environmental and economic impact of package choices they make. And it's pretty cool. I was actually working in Germany when they enacted that, and it was, you could see people making decisions pretty quickly. So we don't use that in our country. We are the only industrialized country to not use extended producer responsibility, that type of system. But we're hoping, right? There's legislation underway, hopefully to get that passed in the US.
We have a participant who's very interested in your packages and are wondering if there are some availabilities of close-up photos or even a short video of how those packages, the prototypes functioned, saying it was difficult for him to see how some of them opened, dispensed, and then reclosed for further use, and was wondering if the consumer testers also had difficulty kind of figuring out those packages.
Yeah, so they did watch a video, and we had a pre-recording, so they each all had the same information. So they watched a recording of the package opening and closing and things like that. But yeah, with remote testing, it's better often to have the consumers actually touch it. One of the comments that was made about the paper. In fact, there's things you can do to make the paper more rigid with design, and we did have creases in there to show the portioning and things like that. But consumers often think of paper as being flimsy, whereas if they were actually able to hold the paper tray and say, oh gosh, this isn't as flimsy as I thought it would be, and compare it sort of to the polystyrene, they may have not made those types of comments with the paperboard tray. But yeah, certainly touching things is always better. I know a lot of us are actually ordering food online, and we don't get to see it up close, and so it's a definite disadvantage. But AURI has those videos if you'd like to
What
have them in the pictures.
Very good. What percentage of emissions did you study? What percentage of emissions of reductions will packaging make relative to beef cattle total emissions?
That's
sure.
Yeah, I understand that question. I would refer you to a publication if you want. You can send me an email and I can send you the publication. But the people from AURI may laugh because I think I'm sending everyone to this publication. But it's Poor and Nemic. I think it was a couple of years ago. You can actually see that data, and they look at the life cycle impact throughout the entire value chain, going from grass growing or whatever the beef cattle eat, all the way up to post-consumer. So I know about that information, but that was not part of the spec for this product. We looked at the life cycle impact of the package. We would love to work on a project involving food waste and packaging waste, linking the two together.
Another attendee says, I think you briefly mentioned bioplastics. Would there be opportunities to collaborate with other ag interests to use ag-based bioplastics?
Oh, yeah. So many opportunities. Coke and Pepsi actually use bio-derived polyethylene in their or PET in their bottles. We see Stonyfield Farms using bio-derived yogurt containers and things like that. So it's coming more in the mainstream. Again, it's those economics that are troublesome with oil prices being so low. But we are seeing that really resonate with consumers. Yes, that is a great opportunity. We do see more bio-derived PET and things like that. Consumers don't typically know that we have bio-derived plastics out there in the marketplace now, but we do have quite a bit, and that is a great opportunity.
Back to your presentation, given that the current package actually has a low environmental impact, do you think it's best to try to improve the sustainability, consumer perception of the current package, or try to focus on a package type that consumers think is more sustainable and then work hard to make it actually more sustainable?
Well, I guess the answer is both, right? Okay. We've actually worked in the meat industry, and we know from manufacturing processes and things like that the foam tray is really needed, right, by manufacturers. And so that would be my first step, is to try to have the current package really resonate with consumers. I'm not a marketing person, but things that companies are using, especially with expanded polystyrene and other expanded plastics like polyethylene, is where the air comes from. And I think I alluded to it in my presentation. It'd be fun to have, air from Iowa, I don't know, or Nebraska, or wherever the meat is coming from, or Minnesota, fresh to your table. So anyway, I think that's a major opportunity. I think it would be kind of fun to work on something like that. The second approach is really interesting because you know, if you take something that's not so sustainable, but then you try to tell consumers that, okay, yeah, this is a sustainable packaging, then the waters get muddied a little bit. Consumers are seeing a lot of disinformation about a lot of things, but also about plastics and recyclability and things like that in the United States. And so what a lot of people are doing is, as opposed to reinventing the wheel, is really recognizing that you know, most industrialized countries have been working with recycled plastics and recycled products and packaging sustainability for about the past 20, 25 years. And boy, they know a lot, right? So we can really jump forward and do kind of like a technology leapfrog or pole vault using that, science and using that knowledge and infrastructure development that has been done so well in other countries.
So why do you think the consumers rated the current package in the plastic bag low on that sustainability scale?
I think they saw plastic. I think they saw huge swaths of plastic. And when consumers see unbroken plastic, you know, even if it's even a color breaking up the plastics, logos breaking up plastics, they think of it as more sustainable. So I do think it's the huge swath of unbroken plastic. For some reason, consumers identify plastic as being really low on sustainability. They worry about all that plastic and things like that in the ocean, but that's two different issues. What we do with the plastic at the end, I specifically don't throw it in the ocean. You know, if you live in Minnesota, you're not near the ocean. But if you throw it in the Mississippi, it could eventually end up in the ocean, right? But you know, we have to have the infrastructure to recycle and handle that plastic. And then we also have the infrastructure to source it very responsibly. So it's two different issues, but it is confusing for consumers.
And for those attending today who aren't real familiar with the LCA, why do we use life cycle analysis?
Yeah, life cycle analysis is a metric. And so we saw the results of what happens when consumers assess environmental sustainability. You know, there's a lot of different reasons why consumers would assess the expanded polystyrene tray as being low on the really bad for the environment, which they did. But it's really important to have the facts and know that factually the expanded polystyrene tray is actually more sustainable than some alternatives that could be used out there. So it's to actually get the facts, and that's really important, because if our end goal as consumers is to have a low environmental impact, as lowest environmental impact as we can, then we really need to know what those numbers are, as opposed to just guess if something is more sustainable or not.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sand, for a very informative presentation today. That concludes AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday for today, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. AURI's mission is to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. In December, we will be featuring a discussion on COVID-19. The virus has impacted nearly every aspect of American life and business. In July of this year, a coalition of Minnesota food and agriculture groups partnered to survey processors and manufacturers to better understand the supply chain effects of COVID-19. This webinar will highlight the survey results from over 100 survey respondents from across Minnesota and provides takeaways on improving supply chain resiliency. That's coming up December 16th from noon till 1. And you can register right now at auri.org/webinar-Wednesday.